Hey, what's up everyone? It's Zach. I'm coming at you today with 29 questions about RxJS and Angular. So just for some background on where the idea for this little video came up, I am a presenter at NgConf this year, and today we had a Q&A panel for people to ask experts on RxJS in the Angular community, some questions about RxJS, Angular, how they work together. There was a lot of questions about NgRx and so on. So we had this Q&A session, and there was a lot of questions. I felt like we only got to a few of them, and there was a lot of panelists, and I already felt bad for talking too much when there is other really well thought people on the panel as well. So I wanted to just take some time to come on afterwards and address the questions. I was able to grab a copy of the transcript from the chat. So I'll just be stepping through all the questions that were asked in the panel and giving my thoughts on them, because I felt bad that we didn't address some of them and felt like I wasn't able to give a whole answer to others. So I'll be doing that in this video. And yeah, huge props, by the way, to the NgConf team. I felt extremely energized after day one, and I was only able to see some of it, but yeah, it was invigorating after this long time of kind of being in quarantine to have some interaction, even if it's still remote. Just still the community and everything the NgConf team has done to bring that together. I give them a lot of respect and props for that. So thanks, y'all. Also, make sure you catch me and Nicole. We're going to be giving a talk on reactive code and animations on day 2. I'm really looking forward to presenting that. As a little disclaimer, it was very clear from the panel that my views aren't exactly in line with everyone else's on the panel, but I think everyone else on the panel kind of had their own take on a lot of these answers. So just some disclaimer, these are my views. I would love to get anyone on that panel to come on the podcast, or we can do an episode or something like that to talk through some of the ways we differ, because I think there's a lot of interesting thoughts that could come out of that conversation, personally for me, for myself, and also for other people to listen to. So if anyone from that panel is watching this, or if you're out there and you have some ideas, please be sure to comment with any ideas, or if you are on the panel, reach out to me on Twitter or something. Maybe we can figure out a way to compare and contrast ideas. And for anyone, if you have any more questions that don't really get addressed in this video, make sure you ask in the comment section, and I'll look to do a follow-up video with any questions that come up. So yeah, I'll be looking forward to that, because I think I quite like this format, and we'll see how it does. But yes, also make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy this video. Shameless plug. I have no shame about it. But yeah, it helps the channel, and I appreciate it if you do. So anyways, without further ado, let's get into the questions. So the first question that came up was, are there any new RxJS operators worth noting? So the way I'd like to address this question is maybe first going over my core mental model for how I think about observables. Because especially compared to many members of the RxJS core team, I've noticed, like Ben Lesh and Jan Nicholas, I feel like my understanding is more abstract, whereas they're when they talk about it, I feel they are more technical in the way they approach things. And yeah, anyways, just to get into the framework of how I think about these things. The mental model I often grab for is observables are like timelines. They are some instruction set of how a given property is going to change over time. or how a given piece of data changes over time. So if you think about this in terms of a timeline, it's like in your history books, think of like elementary school history books, like a timeline that's like starts in 1950, ends in, I don't know, present day or something like that. You would see that line going across horizontally, and there's probably some dashes on that line. Those dashes map to some event that happened in the year that it happened on. That's how I see observables, is they're a timeline, and they have events that occur along the way. So yeah, that's what an observable looks like. An operator then is a function that takes one timeline and creates a new timeline from it. And yeah, so like if you think about it in terms of that, when you create a pipe and you put operators into that pipe, you are actually, by combining all those operators together, you're really taking a timeline. That first operator in the pipe changes it to a new timeline. Then you move on to the second operator in that pipe, and you do it again, and that creates a new timeline. And you keep going forward like that. So actually what you're doing inside of that pipe is you're making a new operator. You're composing what is a new operator that's kind of pipelining through all those other, like, you almost think of them as like operator primitives to create your new operator in terms of that one observable. So the way that works, again, is just taking some beginning observable, the thing that you call pipe on, calling a bunch of stuff, new observable after all of that. So yeah, it's kind of like you can just flatten all those things down to one. So yeah, the way I think about these, there's really, I don't know. I don't feel like I have an encyclopedic knowledge of all the different operators and what they do, and if there's any new ones or anything like that. But yeah, I come across a scenario where, I think about it exactly that way. I have some source observables I'm thinking of. I want to get to some new timeline by either combining them or like manipulating the data and the events they're emitting in some way, and creating a new observable at the end of all of that. That's my mental model I go with, and then I kind of Google and like look up operators to figure out a clever way of getting from A to B via pipeline, via the pipe method. So yeah, that's my thinking on that. Kind of like a non-answer, but I think it's a good jumping off point for a lot of the discussions we'll have later on. But yeah, moving ahead, because we got 29 questions. I spent way too much time on that one, and I want to get to them all. So let's keep going. All right, so number 2 here. I saw this tweet yesterday. What do you guys think? So this is, how do you call an Angular workspace with 5 apps that uses 200 plus subscribes and only one async? And I made sure in the screenshot to capture Chow's response, which pretty much sums up my feelings about it. So there's a couple things that I wanted to mention with this question. So with subscribe, and this is something we'll get to in all the questions, I'm sure, but I try as much as possible to use the async pipe exclusively for subscriptions. The reason why, maybe to steal a line from Ward Bell, I want Angular to work for me. I don't want to have to work for Angular. So I want to hand over my observables to Angular, tell it to do whatever it's going to do. I don't want to worry about managing these things or figuring out whatever I want to do with them. I just want to throw them in my template and put in the async pipe, and just kind of have access to whatever gets submitted from them there. So yeah, I do whatever I can to avoid subscribes. I think there's 2 big problems that come with subscribing inside of your component TypeScript class. One of those is managing the subscription. So it's very possible and very easy to get sort of subscription leaks which is where you have an open subscription that never completes and just kind of hangs out for the whole life cycle of your user going on your app. And probably not a huge deal in most scenarios. I've seen it actually become a problem in some places, in some apps I've worked on before, and they are kind of nasty when they do actually cause problems. But yeah, for the most part, it's a minor concern, but still probably not something you wanna have mucking up your app. Just like a little time bomb that you're setting for yourself at some point. So that's reason number one. You don't want to call subscribe explicitly yourself. Is because you don't want to worry about managing subscriptions. Piece number two, why you don't want to call subscribe. Subscribe, I think, lends itself to writing imperative code. Because inside of that subscribe, it's very likely you're taking whatever was emitted from that observable and you're setting other class properties based on that value that got emitted. And in my opinion, when you start doing that, you start losing a lot of the power that comes with RxJS. Which is you can write declarative code where, like, each one of those properties, if there's a property in your component class that you expect to change, I almost always and almost exclusively use observables for that property. So rather than having like a count property that you start at the top of your component, you say count equals 0, and then throughout different methods inside of your class, you're changing that count in different ways as you go along. Rather than do that, you create it as an observable of a number, and you define inside of that observable, like inline. These are all the events that could change and affect that count, and here it all is. It's all in one spot, all located right there. And I think it's a more helpful mental model. I think it's a lot easier way to, provided someone understands RxJS, I think it's a much better and cleaner way to write components. So that's my thoughts on that. Let's move ahead to the next question. And this one's a big one. This one's a really good one. Okay. RxJS versus NgRx for state management, the pros and cons of each. So I said something during the panel on this question, and I think the main point I wanted to get across was RxJS is very generic, in my opinion, very generic reactivity. It doesn't matter which framework you're in. It's just, it doesn't, like, you could use it in vanilla JavaScript. You probably could use it in some other frameworks. I think we'll get to that in some of the future questions. But there's nothing Angular-ish about RxJS, right? Like, it's just a way of managing events, really, or managing timelines. If you're going with my analogy. NgRx, in comparison, I think is quite domain specific. And I'm not saying that as a bad thing. Like, NgRx, I think, does an amazing job at taking sort of the flux pattern and making it super, super simple and perfectly synchronizing it with all the concerns you usually find in an Angular context. So, like typing and the figuring out the ng modules and stuff like that. NgRx is the perfect solution for that. And the way it breaks these pieces down, like, reducers are just functions that take a current state and an action and create a new state. Actions, just objects, just an object with serializable data that has a type property. That's pretty much all it is. And then selectors are just functions that take a state and return a value from that state. So just a function. And so it takes these very simple building blocks and creates, like, you can create some very complex things with those very simple building blocks. Pros and cons of each. I definitely think there's pros and cons of each of these approaches. RxJS, the pros being generic, that's not like Angular specific knowledge that you have to have. if your team ends up deciding, okay, we're going to go with one of the kind of state management alternatives, like just going with service with a subject or Akita or NgXS or some of these other solutions out there, or Apollo, that's a good one too. Your RxJS knowledge is still very much intact. Like RxJS is like the Swiss Army knife, I think, in terms of managing these kinds of things. Whereas NgRx is like the machine itself, with a supremely constructed machine that exposes all the right things and gives you all the right tools you need to like create a very specialized and tuned machine for the application you have in mind. That's kind of the ways I think about it. I wanted to mention as well, I think a huge benefit of NgRx that I don't think it gets enough credit for is the ways it takes a lot of the dimensions of RxJS and flattens it down into something more manageable. So what I mean by this, if you spent some significant time in RxJS, the rabbit hole can go pretty deep. And it's, in my opinion, the reason for this is because there's so many dimensions that fold in on each other in RxJS that kind of lead to, it leads to so many combinations. It's hard to tell sort of what's going on with some of the solutions if you're just using RxJS. So what I mean by this is like when you have an observable. There's some considerations on that observable, like is it cold or is it hot? And just that being a distinction is kind of like important. But then beyond just an observable being hot, it's also, well, what strategy is that observable emitting in, that hot observable emitting in? Is it like a vanilla subject strategy where when you subscribe, it actually doesn't emit anything immediately, but on the next emission of that hot observable, you will observe something? Or is it, do you subscribe in a behavior strategy, which is where you, as soon as you subscribe, you immediately, always the one thing emitted, and then you continue on like before? Or is it in a replay strategy where you emit some number of past events from that hot observable before then continuing on? Like, these are all considerations you have to understand when you get like an observable out of an API, and it's not immediately apparent what all the details on this are. And there's other dimensions to this as well, like how many times does this observable emit? It could only emit 5 and then stop. And you wouldn't know that necessarily when you just like bring that in from or reference it from a subject, or reference it from a service rather, or what have you. So our NgRx is super flattening in that respect, because your observables that come out of that store, so whether you're subscribing to the store itself or subscribing to store.select or store.pipe or what have you, it's always going to be hot. That observable is always going to be hot, and it's always going to emit with a behavior strategy. I got started in NgRx when I was learning stuff, and the ways it flattened those things down so that almost every observable is hot, every observable you get from NgRx is hot, and they all emit with a behavior subject. I thought this was the way all observables behaved for a good long time. And that was actually really nice. That world was really nice because it was like reliable that you could count on an observable to behave in this given way. And then you kind of open up the doors, like you release the constraints onto just like dealing with RxJS in general. And I feel like you go from this very narrow understanding, in a helpful way, very narrow, to this like throwing the doors open, and things can get complex and unmanageable in that way. So kind of highly recommend NgRx for this. And of course, when I talk about NgRx here, I should mention that I'm thinking about primarily just the NgRx store package. Let's move on to the next question, because I could talk about this for hours. So what is your favorite way to test your observables? Do you use marbles heavily? Do you have a favorite flavor of marbles? So yes, this is interesting because this is one of the ways I differed from a lot of the other panelists, because I love every time I have an observable, I want to make sure I use marble diagrams to test that observable, because in my mind, that's the best way of knowing, number one, I built what I meant to build. And number two, like, yeah, it solidifies, in my opinion, marble diagrams solidify a very accurate view of what observables are actually, how observables are actually behaving. So I'm very long on marble diagrams. Is the gist of that story, and it goes back to the description, or to the core understanding I have of observables, where an observable is a timeline, and operators are functions that take a timeline and create a new timeline. And I'll come back to that. Like that's what a marble diagram is amazing at. You can specify using sort of the marble diagram syntax, I guess you could call it. Like here's a timeline. Here's a timeline in ASCII art that shows you my source observable, or sometimes you have multiple sources. So here's all the observables as my input. Then import that operator that you created by piping all these things together or combining them in whatever way you did, and then just expect the resulting observable to be what you want. So it's super easy, in my opinion, to create these very nuanced test scenarios that make sure you capture every piece of what you actually wanted to build, and make sure that the code that you wrote is creating the observables you want. So yeah, that's my take on marble diagrams. I think they're great. I think you should use them in your code base if you are doing unit tests, and that's a whole other story. But and yeah, my favorite flavor of marbles is the ones that come out of RxJS/testing. So the one you're npm installing when you just install RxJS, and just using the test scheduler. So yeah, that's my take on marbles. Moving on. Is there a way to combine Angular lifecycle hooks with other observables? So this gets into something where I don't understand why Angular lifecycle hooks aren't exposed as observables already. Which is, I kind of understand it, but I wish they were exposed as observables in some way. And I know, so a very common pattern of doing this is kind of, you have like your lifecycle hooks, like ng on init. This could be one. And you do all of the normal stuff you do with a component when it implements the on init interface. So like you set up the method, but all that method does is just take like a private observable, or a private subject, I think is what it easily is. You take a private subject and you call next on it. And that's it. And then you just use that subject sort of as your observable of that lifecycle hook. And it gets into weird stuff with this, like what should that subject be, a regular subject or a replay subject or a behavior subject? It kind of fluctuates with the exact use case. So there's some oddities there, but yeah, that's like a solid way, I think, of taking your lifecycle hooks and turning them into observables. Like obviously stuff like the NgOnChanges hook. That's kind of nice when you actually like take the onChanges hook, but then you have the subject. When you call next on the subject, you actually pass the changes that went through it. So that's like a helpful way of like taking these imperative method callbacks and turning them into more declarative code, so that you can use them to compose all your other observables. So that's a potential there. So yeah, that's a good way of doing that. I think there was a talk last year, 2 years ago about this. That goes into more detail on that from NgConf. So definitely go check that one out. If I can find it, I'll put it in the links below. So yeah, that's a good way of turning a lifecycle hook into an observable. It's something I do sometimes. I really like a pattern of having just like one view model observable per component that you just like subscribe to with the async pipe at the top of your component. So yeah, that's how I tend to like things, and the lifecycle hooks can be particularly helpful with that pattern sometimes. So yeah, let's go ahead on to the next question. More like a generic question. I read a lot of articles, found different ways, but which one do you recommend the most to unsubscribe from observables? So my recommendation here is to never manually subscribe in the first place, to always let the async pipe subscribe for you. That's my take on the matter. If you have to subscribe, then I think there's plenty of different ways. I'm not entirely sure which the best one is. Like you can do, there was the pattern I used for a while that was like take until, and then have this like one subject that emitted inside the onDestroy lifecycle hook. So it was like take until that subject emits, which I feel like there might have been some issues with that. I don't know. I tend to just like exclusively use the async pipe, so I'm not sure. But yeah, I feel like those are solid ways of doing it. There's some issues with like taking like those take ones in general, which is like if you do a take one, I think this one came up. If you do an observable where you count on it to complete with a take and a certain number, if you never hit that number, your subscription never closes. And so that includes like if you're doing a network call and the network call never comes back, that observable like stays open forever. So yeah, I think there's like timeouts on the HTTP clients and the observables it exposes, but yeah, it's just like weird possible edge cases that could really throw things in some scenarios. So yeah, I think in general, just take your subscriptions and unsubscribe from them inside of the NgConf hook. That's probably the advice I'd give there. Cool. And yeah, the way you do that is like when you subscribe, you actually create a reference to that subscription. So that's what when you do subscribe, what that actually returns is the subscription object. And so you just kind of set that on your component inside of a property of your class, and then inside of the NgConf hook, you take that subscription, you call .unsubscribe on it. So yeah, I think that's probably the best way of doing it. But yeah, I'm not sure. Favor the async pipe is the moral of the story there, I think. Cool. So next question. We jumped into Angular, and there was a steep learning curve. Before I go finish the question, I feel like that's so true. Like, there seem to be a lot of things in the stack right now for Angular development, or just for web dev in general. Like there's TypeScript, there's Angular, there's forms, there's accessibility, there's all these things that you need to understand. We're not even getting into state management yet. So this is very understandable, I think. But yeah, continuing with the question, RxJS didn't stick right away, and we started coding imperatively. Any ideas for helping a team shift from coding imperatively to reactively? So, I have a talk on this. It's called the DeRose Hypothesis, declarative versus imperative code. I'll link to that below if you want. If you want a more in-depth approach to this question and like imperative versus declarative coding, I think. So I think there are some considerations here that you want to take seriously, I think. So some of the considerations are RxJS is very RxJS is very good, it's very powerful, it's very precise, but it does come with a significant learning cost. If you are ready to make that cost and you have a long-running project and you have a team that is ready to be invested in it, then I say go for it. Go for the reactive code, and I think and like learn together and stick together and like help each other through the journey. And I think that investment will pay a lot of dividends in the long run. If you're not in that scenario, if you have a very small app and you need to get it out and you don't plan to support it further, I'm almost like, yeah, go ahead and do that imperatively. Just get it out the door. Maybe you have some bugs in it. Like, it's if that's okay, do that because yeah, and if you have made the initial investment in RxJS, I feel like it makes things easier. It definitely makes things simpler. I feel like RxJS is very helpful at letting you build components with Lego blocks instead of knitting them together with yarn. I feel like imperative code is very much like knitting a castle together versus imperative code, or versus reactive code is like getting a bunch of Lego blocks and arranging them in the right way. And then making a change in that reactive world is simply like moving a Lego block somewhere else, or switching out one Lego block for another, or something like that. I think there's a lot of power in that. I think it pays huge dividends as a project's life cycle goes on and spans like years or something like that. So yeah, if you have the resources, or if you've already paid the resources, if you've already like learned RxJS, I think always go for a reactive approach is my advice. If not, ask yourself if you're in the situation where you want to support this long term and you're ready to make the investment. You're going to start slow, but it's going to accelerate. If that is a situation that will benefit you, then go for RxJS. Otherwise, stick with imperative stuff. And yeah, if you're looking for interesting ways to shift from imperative to reactive, check out the talk I mentioned. And yeah, if this is something you want more material on, please comment or let me know in some way. Because this is something I feel very strongly about in terms of the long-term benefits of reactive code or declarative code, and we'll be happy to figure out some more material around this subject specifically. All right, next question. What is a common best practice on feeding data to a component from an HTTP call to a component without the async pipe creating infinite HTTP calls? Okay, so this is an interesting question because, yeah, it's just interesting. So HTTP client. I'm assuming because we're in an Angular context, we're using the HTTP client in this scenario. So if you take that HTTP client and you call the get method, it's going to return you an observable. And that observable, first off, it's going to be cold. It doesn't actually do anything until you subscribe to it, right? And yeah, another thing about the observable returned by that get method is it's going, if it does emit, it's going to emit one and then emit once and then complete. So there's some considerations around that. If you take a reference to this observable and you just stick it into your template and put it into the async pipe, that will when that piece of the DOM renders inside of the browser, it will subscribe to that observable, make the HTTP call, return, and then yeah, and then you're kind of done. The issue is if for some reason that DOM in terms of your DOM tree, this piece keeps getting re-rendered, you keep making HTTP calls from it, because yeah, that's just the way things work. So if you're looking at this, if you're having this problem, one thing you want to probably look at is hot observables and think different ways of making that observable hot. Because what you want to do is, and this comes out in some other ways too. Like, this doesn't only happen when you make, like, when you just take the observable returned by that get and you stick it in the template. It also happens in many cases where that observable is like one of the pieces of all the other, like, all these other things that compose this observable that you're subscribing to with the async pipe in your template. And it can lead for confusing pieces where you make way more network calls than you intend to. So I think that's what this question is getting at. So a very helpful way of getting into this, if you can make that observable hot and you can sync the data from that HTTP call. It's almost like by making it hot, you're kind of caching that response, and you're doing it in such a way that if you do need to make a new HTTP call, because like you need to make a new call with new inputs or a new body or something like that, you want to set that up so it does make the call in a certain way. And that's kind of where, like, marble diagrams come into play. I think they can be very helpful for that. But yeah, you kind of want to just make sure that you're setting you're making that observable hot, and it's by doing that you can make sure you only make the network call when you intend to. So yeah. Hope that was helpful. If not, feel free to ask more questions down below, and we'll dive in deeper. Okay, next question. I'm having this discussion with my team. Some people think that using async await promises is fine within Angular. I disagree. I think you should use observables as much as possible to make sure you don't get timing issues. What is your opinion? Okay. I feel like I am in the minority in this scenario, but I think that promises and async await is perfectly fine within Angular and can be very helpful in many scenarios. I think it's especially observables that emit once and then complete, and then that's all they're ever designed to do. I think that's where promises and especially async await can really, really shine in terms of taking some complex code and flattening it down to something very simple. Like, in my opinion, promises are like very specific. They're like an isosceles triangle or something like that, right? And then observables are like, if promises is an isosceles triangle, observables are just polygons. Like they're this big superset, and promises are something very, very specific inside of that huge superset that observables are. And if you have the case that matches that isosceles triangle, it actually helps, in my opinion, to have a very specific and constraint API to deal with that. And async await in particular, I think, shines a lot where that's actually the case. I think there are a lot of problems with relying exclusively on promises. I feel like that always turns into situations where you're not being fully precise, or you're not actually coding things the way you want to, but you're getting them to like a way that works most of the time. And there's probably some timing issues, but whatever. But yeah, in scenarios where you have an observable that emits only once and then completes immediately, I think calling like toPromise on that, or just even like exposing just never being an observable, it's just always existing as a promise. I feel like that's fine, and I think it can really clean code in some scenarios. It can get to, like, this stuff gets weird if you're doing testing with the test bed. You kind of got to know how to do async tests and make sure you hit like manually hit the change detection to make sure everything's actually working. And there's like kind of some weirdness there, but yeah, on the whole, I'm very long on still using promises within Angular. So, and I don't think observables completely makes promises obsolete. I think promises still have their place. They're the more specific API, and that can be helpful in some scenarios. So yeah, code bases that only use observables, I'm kind of okay on that. Like I still think you should probably use, there's probably some places where promises will clean up that code base. A code base that uses both observables and promises where it's helpful, I think that's the best scenario. I think code bases that exclusively use promises in Angular, I think that's probably doing something wrong. So yeah, that's my opinion on that. Number 10, top 3 suggestions to share data objects between microfrontends. I don't know. I don't know if this is super pertinent to RxJS, but and I'm no expert on microfrontends, so I'll preface that with this. I will say in some scenarios, local storage seems very promising for this. It obviously comes with a caveat that you definitely don't want to persist to disk any personal information. That could be a huge concern that should rule out local storage for you if that's your use case. If you're like a bank or someone dealing with health information, do not do that because it's going to lead to problems. If you have just only innocuous data, like you're running like a Pokedex app or something like that, then yeah, probably local storage is fine. But that's an interesting way you could do it. I think it's like kind of global variables is like decent. I don't know. The whole micro front end thing, to be honest, seems to come with a lot of costs, especially hearing some of the talks on that earlier in day one, or some of the considerations on that earlier in day one here. I'm very hesitant to jump into micro front ends. I feel like in many ways I want to use Angular to manage all of my front end pieces, and it seems easier to do that with one app than deploying a bunch of other apps. And yeah, if the benefit you're getting from that is you can like deploy certain pieces of your app independently of others, I don't see that as like a big enough benefit to be worth the cost, to be honest. Maybe it will be, and you know, it's definitely exciting stuff. It's definitely interesting stuff. But yeah, sharing state across micro front ends. It would be interesting to see if NgRx comes out with a really good way of doing that. So yeah, I'll keep my eye on the micro front ends thing, but I'm not super long. I'm pretty short on micro front ends at the moment. All right. Next question is longer. Let's get into it. How can I best explain the benefits of reactive programming in a code base that uses NgRx but unwraps every observable for combining them in the components? I know this is not good practice, but I'm having a hard time explaining to senior devs how that is not reactive programming and what reactive Angular should look like. I haven't found a single article video explaining how imperative programming would be an anti-pattern, specifically when using NgRx. Okay, let me make the assumption by when they say unwrapping every observable, what they mean here is they're subscribing to it, and then they're subscribing to it and setting properties inside of that, and like having things go from there. I think that's probably what they're asking here, but I am making that assumption. So if I made the wrong assumption, please forgive me to whoever asked this question. But okay, the first piece of NgRx is if you're using the selectors properly, it is actually very easy to take those selectors and compose them down into like to take so when you call like create selector, you actually pass in a series of preceding selectors, and then a function that takes what each one of those previous selectors had emitted, and then or returns rather, and then returns that function tells you how to combine those all to get exactly the piece of data you want. So I often do it for the components. Remember, I talked about the view model pattern. If all of my data is in NgRx, which is where I usually like it, where I usually like my code bases to be, all my global state is in NgRx, then what I'll do for purposes of that view model pattern is take all the kind of generic selectors that are exposed from from your where you created the store, and combine those down into one very specific selector that takes all the different pieces that you actually need from your component and flattens them down into one observable of one object. And then you just subscribe to that object inside of your template using the async pipe, and then you just kind of declaratively create your HTML from there. And you always have access to every piece of data you need from your NgRx store that way. That is super valuable. You don't have to call subscribe anywhere inside of your component, and usually your components become your component TypeScript becomes nothing. It's just here's one observable that's a property of this component, and it is equal to store.select and then that custom selector you just built, and that's it. That's all that's going on inside of your component. I really like that. I think that's the reason why you do NgRx, is for that simplicity, because you put everything else into all the the code you wrote for the reducers and the selectors and all that stuff. And I see this a lot where they're talking about unwrapping the observable by just subscribing to it and then doing other stuff in that. And I probably did that too when I first started. But there's a better world out there, and you want to be lazy with some of these stuff. NgRx is very good at helping you be lazy about that stuff. I will say that there are some APIs from Angular, reactive forms and the HttpClient and some other stuff that you may want to it may not fit well with the NgRx store. It may not be something you actually want to persist in your global state. And then I think it's perfectly reasonable to have those as other observables inside of your component that actually if we're thinking about the view model pattern again, you just pass that observable that is exposed by these APIs, throw it up as a parameter of that view model function you're creating to create a view model observable of your component. And you also throw the store in there. and so take your router and the events from that router, throw it into your function that creates a view model, but also throw the store in there, and then throw any other observable that you need from one for Lifecycle hook that you care about. It can go up in there too, and then it becomes, this view model becomes this black box. I often throw into a different file altogether and just say, okay, here's all the inputs to it. It's here's the router, here's the NgRx store, here's an observable that represents the on-init lifecycle hook or something like that. Take all those, use the RxJS to combine them down into the single observable, and really what that is one big operator, right, at the end of the day. And I use marble tests to make sure I'm for each one of those inputs, I mock out exactly what observable that input could look like. So I create all my different scenarios that way. And I make sure it always creates the one observable that behaves the way I want to. And then that's my component logic right there in that one file. And then my components class is really just I think components should just be view logic at the end of the day. So I typically don't want to see complex RxJS stuff if I can help it. But yeah, it makes for a really nice pattern to just say, okay, create view model, pass in all the needed parameters, use dependency injection inside of that component to get all the different pieces I need for the parameters to that view model function, and then just return the observable from there. And that's then take that observable into your template, subscribe to it with the async pipe at the top of your component. That's always money. There are some trade-offs to that, whereas by having the one object or the one observable rather that emits every time, so that observable or that observable has to emit every time something in that object emits. And so it's technically like maybe a little less performant than just creating separate observables for each one of those properties, because like the benefit is you only subscribe once at the top, and then like you just write HTML from there. That's huge. I think that's huge for writing this stuff, but it comes at the cost of some like minor performance, because that observable is emitting more, and so like more of your DOM tree is changing more than it probably absolutely needs to, because like I don't know, if you had like a header content property on that object, like you actually need to re-render that header every time it changes, or like recompute it every time that observable emits, even though probably that header is not changing every single time something about that object emits. Versus if you had a specific observable for that header content, you could be very specific about just how often that changes. But like it's such a minor thing. I think the ease of like just constructing that is worth the cost of like slightly worse performance. So that's my take. I think it's like trivially worse performance. Regarding a single video explaining how imperative programming would be an anti-pattern, especially when using NgRx, I do have a video on like very basic NgRx stuff. I'm relatively proud of. I still want to get better at making videos, obviously, but I'll be interested in sharing some of this view model pattern I'm describing here as a way of like to not focus on the negative of the anti-patterns, maybe focusing on a good pattern that could get the rest of your team excited about using stuff with NgRx. I think that could be good, and yeah, I'll see about making that video at some point in the future. And I'll link to the one video I have on NgRx down below. I don't think it really gets to the problem you're describing. It maybe kind of touches on it, but yeah, I think you're right on. It's probably an anti-pattern to be doing a bunch of imperative subscription callbacks inside when using NgRx. All right, next question. I've ran into this scenario a couple times recently where I'm using the async pipe on the same observable multiple times with the same template. I've seen a couple of ways to handle this, but have settled on using pipe multicast, new replay subject, ref count. Is that okay? Is there any better way besides using a wrapper element with ngIf? So this was actually asked in the panel. I think I gave a frazzled answer, because this is getting into, I think again, you're getting into hot and cold. Like really what you're doing here is making your cold observable hot. So like syncing it to other subscriptions. And using this subject here, using this subject here to kind of sync between other subscriptions to your observable, which it's kind of a complicated thing if you get into that piece. It's hard to talk about, but yeah, I tried. I have this link here. I'll make sure I put it. It's probably not super helpful, but I'll put it into the subscription or to the comments down below. It's my talk called WTF is a cold observable, and this is like a recap of the different ways you can kind of make stuff hot. Like multicast is sort of the primitive at the top of all this, and then there's like the public strategy versus the share strategy, and then there's different kinds of subjects you could be using to sync these things up. It kind of gets into that. But yeah, I think this is a solid way of making that observable hot is, I think, in many ways the right way to handle this complexity if it's something you're hitting a lot. I do think the pattern, the view model pattern, could really help here, because you would avoid most of these problems, I think, entirely. But yeah, I think this is very, very similar to the question with the HTTP client question, like how do I avoid making infinite network calls using the async pipe with the HTTP client. These are kind of getting at the same thing, I think. So yeah, interesting stuff around here. And yeah, go check out that video if you're interested in more information on that. All right, next question. A common pattern in our team is to combine multiple observables via combine latest or fork join, making data retrieval synchronous. Oftentimes, a subset of the data returned is manipulated with operators. What is an alternative pattern to this? Also, we tend to perform side effects within operators. How do we avoid this? Okay, so a couple things here that trying to unpack this question. Just the way some of these functions work. So combine latest is very specific. It takes I believe it takes now an array, not a comma separated list, but an array of observables, and it subscribes to each, and it creates a new observable from all of those subscriptions. And it doesn't emit until everything inside of that array has emitted at least once. And then after they've emitted at least once, the news observable will emit anytime any of them emit, which can lead to a lot of thrashing in terms of the events emitted by the end observable, especially if you're putting like a bunch of selectors into your combine latest from NgRx. Like, just because of the way the selectors work, like whenever that your state changes, each one of the observables created by select is going to change at the same time. So you actually have like the observable is going to emit X amount of times, where X is how many selectors were in your combine latest, which could be problematic. Sometimes it's all right, but it's not always the best way of going about things. I'll leave it at that. Like, yeah, so it's not always the best tool. Getting into the specifics of like how the observables, like how each of the observables work with each other, and like creating the right combination of like the primitive operators to get to the big operator you really want. It all comes down to that. So I'm like long on creating the marble diagrams to make sure the code you wrote is what you actually want from your end observable. And if you're using combine latest, it's probably not. Fork join is similar. There's like weird caveats of that where I don't think it emits until everything inside of it completes, which is like, I don't know. It's I'd have to look up fork join real quick, but there's other weird stuff about that. So if you're using NgRx, definitely look into composing selectors from other selectors as a way to avoid a lot of the issues that could come with this. You look at using like some combination of switch mapping, merge mapping, concat mapping, or merge and concat, and all some of the alternatives to combine latest and fork join, to actually get to like the real observable you want at the end. Also, for tending to perform side effects within operators, how can we avoid this? My advice to this is probably to rely more on the async pipe. If you do that, I think it's less likely that there's side effects you want to perform, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's kind of my advice there. This is a very hard question, in fairness. Like it's hard to clamp down on not making side effects within operators. I think you probably don't. And if you do have side effects, I think you want to call it out explicitly with a tap operator. But yeah, that's probably as good as I can do on that one. All right, next question. About exported functions. We as a dev team started using exported functions instead of service functions because exported functions have to be pure. Now we have a split world, service functions on one hand and exported functions on another hand. Do you have an advice about where to put that exported functions and how to organize them without losing the possibility of tree shaking them? How about testing exported functions? Exported functions can be tested very well because they are pure, but to me they feel like private function tests because when I use them in a component I will test them again and I cannot spy on them. Okay, so a lot of happening in this question. I think what's happening is I think they're talking about this pattern that I see a lot where you have a service that is like plugged into dependency injection and all this stuff, and you kind of made the service because it's like an Angular-ish thing to do. If it's not a component, it's like a service, right? But I see a lot of times services that, in my opinion, shouldn't be services and shouldn't like be depending on dependency injection, because really all that service is like a way of exporting, like a way of packaging up and sending out utility functions is kind of the way I see it a lot. And I don't, in my opinion, that's not what a service should be. I'm not sure if that's valid or not, but that's kind of my take on it. I think functions are extremely powerful, and I prefer to just export a function if I can versus if I have some functionality, I want to export it as a function. I don't want to wrap it in a service and figure out how that works with dependency injection and all that stuff just to get a function out there so that I can use it in my code base. So I tend to favor exported functions over services with a bunch of methods that just could have been functions anyways. And if they do need something that you typically need dependency injection for, it's like just have the thing that would be injected as a parameter of that function, right? Like if you need the HttpClient, just have that be a parameter of the function, and do whatever you need to do from there, and let whatever calls it worry about the dependency injection to get that into scope. So yeah, that's my take on that. I think exporting functions for that purpose is generally I'm long on that. You have a split world. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. I tend to, if you have like services that only exist to be a dictionary of functions, my thing would be to try to migrate away from that if you can. If you can't, it's not like it's hurting you a lot. So I want to go out of my way to undo that if you already have that world. But it could be a consideration. But having a split world, I don't think is necessarily bad. Do I have any advice on where to put that exported functions, how to organize them without losing the possibility of tree shaking them? Just put them into some. I'm always in an NX workspace, so like do like a workspace lib that like exports these functions as a util library, and you can just like export them that way and use them across your code base. And then how about testing exported functions? They can be tested very well because they are pure. Yeah, and I like this. They're hitting all the right notes. I think it's very easy to test these things because you don't need to, like, you can just mock out anything that's in a parameter to it, and they become very easy to test that way where you don't need the Angular test bed to set everything up. So I like that about just exporting the functions. To me, they feel like private function tests because when I use them in a component, I'll test them again and I cannot spy on them. Okay, so a couple things here. One, I think what this is talking about is when you actually use these exported functions in a component, I think they're saying it's hard to mock them because they're not using dependency injection. They're actually imported into the into the file. And so you just like, yeah, you do what you're going to do, and then you call the function somewhere in there because it was imported. So yeah, and there's nothing really RxJS about this question, but that's okay because I like the way this is going. But yeah, I think in general, you don't need to spy on these functions because if they're really just doing functionality without side effects, you probably don't need to spy on them and mock their implementation or anything like that. Like you can just run your component test and like just let the actual function run, and like mock the things that you would pass into that parameter or pass in as parameters to this function inside your test bed. But yeah, when it comes to the functionality, just let it run probably. If you really want to mock it, there are ways of just like mocking the import using Jest to just like, or I'm pretty sure Karma has ways of doing that too. But yeah, you can still mock an import so that you can just completely mock out the way that function works if you want to. So that's an option, but probably you don't need to. Like probably you just want to actually let the full functionality run and let the chips fall where they will, and that's probably gives you more accurate tests. So I hope I answered that well enough. If not, again, let me know in the comments. We'll move on. Rather than the operator, are there any cool new problems that used to be hard to do with observables that are better now? Yeah, I think, in my journey, I could definitely say this is true. I don't know if this was necessarily because of any changes to the RxJS library as much as it is just getting more experience with the library and understanding better how things work and just being more familiar with the observables and not having an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone and what exactly they do, but just having a good sense of which ones are out there for you to be able to use, right? So yeah, I think RxJS, like I said in previous questions, it really pays dividends if you pay the investment to learn it. That was a good question, thank you. So next, number 16, we're getting there. We're over the halfway point. Okay, RxJS and NgRx maybe, more specifically state management. We have a communication platform which consists primarily of phone queues, Outlook Exchange integrations, calling, profiles, deploys, present statuses, etc. Okay, so we have a rather complex system that's driven by *SIP, but we don't share that much data between components through the flow. Are there any rules of thumb of when to implement state management through an actual state management library instead of simply using RxJS? Okay, so really good question. Thank you for this question. I think it's asking a really good question that I probably won't be able to do justice to in this video, but that's okay. We can maybe hit the basics and go from there. But in my opinion, there's a big difference between understanding global state versus local state. So local state, I usually think of something that is specific to a component. Like forms are a good example, I think, of local state. Like, is this checkbox checked, yes or no? Versus like a global state would be, what is the state of my whole application? So if like local state was just the checkbox, is this on or off? Global state would be like a deeper form of maybe that same thing, but like when you hit the save button inside of the component, you then send that signal up to your larger application that lets it know, okay, they saved that check mark, go ahead and set it in your global state. So yeah, I think understanding what belongs in global state and understanding what happens in local state is important. In my personal opinion, to manage global state, I like to use NgRx to manage all that stuff for me. When it comes to local state management, I tend to reach for just RxJS by itself. I'm very familiar with RxJS, so it's like a natural choice for me, but I think those two pieces play very well together. And like when I talk about the view model pattern, that's essentially what I'm doing. I'm taking a bunch of like incoming observables, incoming like reactive APIs, and I'm like bending them to my will to make the one observable I want. And so that's, in my mind, that's like all RxJS. So that's all like taking the stuff exposed by my global state and forging them down into what I need for that template inside of my local state. So yeah, for a lot of these things, I'm not super familiar with some of this stuff, but I imagine a lot of these things would probably go in some global state where you actually like care about these things through the course of the application, and you're probably like doing network calls to sync your global state with the backend state. So it's like a whole other piece of this puzzle, right? But yeah, like having a good understanding about how those states machines work and implementing them, I think that's very important. And yeah. And so let's see, just sharing that much data between components through the flow. So I think if there's a lot of stuff going on in global state, that may be fine. Like global state is a good way of sometimes maybe syncing data across different components that needs to be synced across those different components. So that's maybe a consideration as well. But yeah. Good question. Thank you very much for that. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, I probably won't have a good answer for this one, but when comparing RxJava with RxJS, the RxJS misses types like single Y. So the ReactiveX libraries that are out there, I'm not familiar with any of them that aren't RxJS, just because I'm like exclusively focused on JavaScript right now. But I think in many ways the ReactiveX libraries tend to try to have similar terminology. So that's like why that flat map operator exists, even though it's just like a straight alias for merge map. So I'm not sure why there's some differences between the two. I think my guess is like, I'm not sure. I just don't know. I don't know what single is, but unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for this. But yeah, thanks for the question anyways. If you know, please answer in the comments, by the way. That's a good plug, right? All right. If we're going to advocate for NgRx-less RxJS, which is what I prefer, I feel like we need more patterns we can follow. If you're going to be using the entire Flux pattern, then use NgRx. So this isn't maybe a question as much as just a statement, but it's a good call out, I think. So I think that's probably why I grabbed it. But in general, I agree with this. I don't agree with putting a service in a subject and just letting that work. Like, to me, I'm very familiar with NgRx. It feels very natural to me to just like construct global state that way. And yeah, I don't know. I would tend to always, in my opinion, if you're going to use Angular, if your app's big enough to use Angular, it's probably big enough to use NgRx. And I think the upsides of NgRx and the simplicity that it reinforces to your apps, if you use it right, I always go for NgRx apps. And yeah, if you're using the entire Flux pattern, then use NgRx. Well, I think like going beyond Flux, just like a basic reducer pattern, like reducing being like, well, you know, we have the reduce operator in RxJS, we have the scan operator in RxJS, kind of takes the same reducer pattern. Array.reduce, all these things. It's just like taking a current state, adding something new to it, and returning some new state. So one object, another object that's like the event that represents the event, and then new thing from that. That's super powerful. And it's baked into NgRx, and it makes things super simple. I think it's definitely it's definitely a good thing to follow. If you're talking about more patterns, NgRx component store I think is interesting. I'm not sold on it yet. I think in many of the scenarios they advocate for like it seems like a decent solution to doing like kind of the local state things that aren't exactly global. It's putting them into local, but I don't know. For me, I just tend to reach for RxJS alone for that, and yeah, I don't know in terms of patterns, it's kind of difficult to describe. I like the view model pattern. I think that's really powerful. Maybe that's what you're looking for. I think it's great if that's what we're talking about. But there's other pieces where it's like there's some state that isn't necessarily like global state, but it's like a little bit bigger than just local state. I think RxJS can be RxJS in a service. Maybe that's a good solution there. I don't know. It's very open to the actual use case, and without a specific use case, it's kind of hard to address. But yeah, that's where I go there. Any tips for debugging observables? I find it's easy to get lost in the call stack. So marble diagrams, again, great for, so not so much debugging, but just making sure the observable is actually doing what you want it to do. Like the view model pattern, if you're going with that, marble diagrams all the way, in my opinion. You'll find a lot of bugs before you even serve, and you'll get things exactly the way you want it to be before you even serve. I definitely advocate throwing tap X arrow console log X being a really good way of debugging observables. Just because, so like if you're going to set breakpoints and stuff like that, you have to be very careful about where you put that arrow, because if you put it on the outside of the operator, you hit that breakpoint when you actually are like registering or like creating the observable, rather than when you're inside of that callback from the operator. So it's like you gotta be very careful where the arrow is. You can kind of get used to it, but it's usually almost always easier to just hit some console logs instead of using breakpoints there. So yeah, that's my advice there. What's the most common error we should avoid with RxJS? I would say, if I had to pick one, I would say thrashing events. Just something to be aware of. If you're doing it and it's not hurting your app, then maybe don't worry about it too much. But you probably, if you are thrashing, like because you're using combined latest with a whole bunch of observables that are all emitting together, you might be hitting some pieces down the road where things really aren't behaving the way you thought. And it's because every time like your global state changes, that one observable is emitting like 8 times. you just don't understand how that could be happening. So that's a concern there. Yeah, I don't know. Hopefully that's a good answer. I'll move on to the next one. This is long enough already. But for someone who doesn't know Angular and wants to learn Angular, would you recommend someone learning RxJS before jumping into Angular? No, I would definitely recommend learning Angular first. I think there's a lot of stuff about Angular that has nothing to do with RxJS that is still like getting into really declarative code and getting into really good patterns and just understanding the framework. I think if the goal is to learn Angular, I think Angular does a really good job of just like jumping into it. And like even if you're learning code and you're learning front end in general, just start with Angular and don't worry about RxJS yet. Just kind of have a healthy curiosity about it. And if you find that you're grasping everything, then maybe lean into RxJS and understand that well, if I'm hitting these examples where I'm like getting lost in my code because I'm changing these properties all over the place, it's very hard to track them over like these more complicated pieces. Like it's very hard to track what all's going on. Just know like RxJS could be a very helpful tool for alleviating some of that pain. So yeah, what is one topic you would not teach to students getting started with RxJS? So in general, if you're going to get started with RxJS and you're going to get started with Angular, I would almost really be like, just go to NgRx, and take advantage of kind of that narrow sampling of all the different features of RxJS. Like they're always hot. Everything emitted from the store is hot, and it always emits with a behavior subject. I think that's a really good way of getting into it. And just like not worrying about like, well, is it hot or cold, or is it emitting with a replay strategy or a behavior strategy or just a vanilla strategy or all this stuff. Like these are stuff you really need to know about and need to know about very well if you go like RxJS only, RxJS vanilla, versus with NgRx. I think it's a really good way to get started and to understand, okay, what are these observables doing, without like drowning. So that would be my advice, I think. I don't need to worry about unsubscribing from observables from HttpClient. Is that correct? Maybe. It's so like we said previously, if you like call the git. So if you subscribe to the git method in an HTTP client, and then you like navigate away before that network call completes, you are like, that's kind of a leak. You probably want to be worried about it a little bit. It may mess some things up depending on what you're doing inside of the subscribe, or if you are subscribing explicitly. So there's some concerns around there. But like, I don't know. In general, if you're asking like, do observables called from the HTTP client self-complete, then yes. If they emit, they complete as soon as they're done. So you probably don't need to be super concerned about like closing them off. If you like leave one out there, if you leave a subscription out there, it might be a problem. I would probably not worry too much about it. You could always just cancel it just to be sure, I guess. But like if you're using the async pipe, I think a lot of that will work for you. So still worry about that edge case. So worry about unsubscribing for that edge case, where you have like the network request still pending when you navigate away. But like unless you're like adding in some custom interceptors, there is going to be an eventual timeout on that, so it will eventually error out, and it's probably okay. So that's the long answer. I would tend to say probably don't worry about unsubscribing from them too much, but if you want to be super sure, you can always unsubscribe for that one caveat. So next question. I heard this morning, please to reduce or eliminate shared state. But wasn't that shared global state the reason Redux 1 out over Flux? Has the pendulum swung towards multiple states being better? Okay. This is an interesting question for sure. I don't know. I think one global state is definitely appealing in many ways. If you think about the object in like the object your NgRx store manages, in many ways the different reducers that you put on that state, like they're it's like each one of those reducers is managing its own slice of that state. It's managing its own this own piece of it. So in my opinion, the one like flat kind of global state, the one state object is still very appealing to me in many ways, because it's like it can simplify a lot of things for you. To instead move from that to like having different pieces managed differently, I tend to think that like muddles things up a little bit more. So like a bunch of services with a subject that have like facades on top of them. I don't know. I don't tend to like that pattern if I can help it. If I can help it, I'll avoid it. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that. I don't know how it works out with the micro front ends. There's interesting problems around there, but I would hope there's still good ways of managing like some global state between like some sort of bus that like works as like the NgRx store would. So yeah, that's my take on that. I don't have experience in React, but do React developers use RxJS? I will say the thing I love using RxJS for in Angular, which is to take a class property that changes over time and use an observable for that. I don't think that use case makes sense in React just because of the way React works. I've definitely spent the majority of my time in Angular, but I've spent a fair share of my time in React now, and to me, I think in many ways hooks in React presents a like domain specific way that is built into to the core of React that it's like a domain specific reactivity, really. Like the use state and use reducer hooks, I think are probably the way you want to manage state and local state in React. You probably don't want to mess with RxJS for local state. I think RxJS still has a place in React in global state. Like if you have stuff like a WebSocket, it makes a lot of sense, I think, to create an observable for that WebSocket communication and to emit on the observable every time you see a message come in, and then like subscribe to that observable and send it through to your stuff. That's kind of my take on RxJS in React. I think it unfortunately has much smaller relevancy inside of React, which is unfortunate. But yeah, there you go. And I think like in their defense too, hooks are very nice for managing a lot of that stuff. They're definitely an easier solution, but it's more imperative. It's weird. Like where all the good parts about React are like it's more functional in my opinion, and it's more domain agnostic. Unfortunately, the way they handle reactivity is like both domain specific in my opinion with like the hooks mechanism, and imperative versus like declarative or functional. So yeah, it's whatever. But yeah, that's my take on that. Is there a good video, talk, note, blog post anyone can recommend for helping guide my team towards reactive programming and away from imperative programming? I need something that contrasts both styles and remark the differences and virtues of reactive. So I have a talk called, I mentioned earlier, the DeRose hypothesis, that talks about declarative versus imperative code. I think, so the gist of that is, I think declarative is like objectively better, and I make that argument in the talk. I'll link to that down below. But there's some examples in that talk about like doing the same exact thing with an imperative style and a reactive style or a declarative style. And yeah, I just think for once you hit some threshold of complexity, it's like the declarative programming becomes so much better for those use cases, in my opinion. And yeah, and to their point, like this is one thing. Like we talk about reactive programming here. I actually don't like that name, reactive programming. I think when we're doing Angular stuff, we're almost always like doing reactive programming. Like the app we're making is reactive. It's changing based on the way things, like because of Angular change detection, like things are changing. Like it's reacting to different things happening, and that can happen even if you're using like an imperative style. So yeah, I think I would tend to say imperative versus declarative, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But yeah, I definitely think declarative programming has its advantages over imperative programming. And yeah, I'll put the link to that talk down below. I love marble diagrams too, Zach. I'm a visual learner, and having those has been a lifesaver for learning RxJS. I absolutely agree with this. Whoever said this is very smart, I think. Because, yeah, I don't know. I felt the same way. Maybe I'm not so much a visual learner, but I was definitely suffering from these mental models that were incomplete. I think I mentioned this in the panel. It's like, without marble diagrams, I was like, hey man, it's like it's all streams and stuff, and they're just like water flowing through these pipes, man. And like that's in general a helpful mental model in my opinion that gets you like most of the way there, but it's like it gets really hazy on some things, and getting to like marble diagrams was like, oh, okay, wait, this is actually solid. Here's something that's solid that shows me this is the timeline, man. This is like the timeline of things happening. It's just like over time, over some period of time, these events are being dispatched or are firing, and that's what an observable is. And then all an operator is just taking an existing timeline, turning it into something new via a function. So yeah, I like this comment. It's not really a question, but I think I probably just highlighted it because I liked it, and they were talking to me specifically. So yeah, thanks for the love. Then marble diagrams are awesome. Mobile testing is burp. I think I know who wrote this. No, just playing. I definitely respect other opinions on marble testing, but to me, like, it's such a useful thing. Like the marble testing, it's like taking the marble diagram, and it's flattening so many dimensions when you do that. Like without marble testing, I feel like if you try to test something anywhere like remotely complex, and you're like managing all those observables and subscriptions yourself, and you're it seems so contrived to figure out how to like call next on like these subjects that are like mimicking your different observables and all this other stuff just to like get this one test case exercise, versus just like having, okay, here's all my input observables. Here's how they all work. Here's a marble diagram for each one. Now, here's what happens when I combine those all in the specific way that I exposed as an operator. And this is how, given those input observables, this is how it should look at the end of the day. That is like so much simpler than doing all that work, in my opinion. So, I don't know. That's my take on that. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like the alternative is so much more painful unless there's like a unless it's like super simple RxJS setup, which maybe most of the stuff is, but yeah, I don't know. And then the last one, probably not a question, but can we all agree that fromEvent is not the way to go in Angular? I disagree with this. So I think fromEvent is super powerful. So fromEvent is a way, it's like a utility function exposed by RxJS to just like pass in a DOM element, and so it takes two parameters, like the element, and then like a string like click, like that, and it creates an observable from this. I think that's super powerful. I actually do mention this in my talk on day 2, if you want to check it out. So yeah, like you can do this with a button that actually gives you an observable of clicks if you have a button, just by like using a view child to get to that, like a view child native element. I tend to like that. Like it's nice in my opinion. It's to me it's better than like having a click handler method that only exists to call next on a subject you otherwise probably wouldn't need. And like yeah, it just seems simpler to me to go about it this way. So yeah, I don't know. That's my opinion. I think it's perfectly fine to do that, and I like to do that in some scenarios where I want to get like an observable of my button clicks. So yeah, that is it, y'all. We did it all the way through 29 questions on RxJS, and yeah, thank you so much for sticking till the end. If you like this, please like and subscribe, and make sure you ask any more questions down below. I'll try to get to them and answer them in a similar format. Thanks so much, and looking forward to more NgConf on day 2. Super excited for it, and I'll see y'all there. Bye now.